Like and subscribe right now, or this spider will crawl on your face while you're sleeping.
Science and technology have managed to make the world a very human-friendly and safe place to be. However, it was not always like this. Today, if someone gets lost, they can quickly summon Google Maps to rescue them and navigate their way back to where they wanted to be. Or if you're lazy enough, you can simply call emergency services for help, or reach out to your family and inform them of your whereabouts. Back in the day, it was always about survival of the fittest, and it required incredible strength, willpower, and intelligence. So without any further ado, here are the 10 craziest survival stories that will show you what it meant to really be helpless back in the day. Let's go. Number 10. Sergeant James Landon. Camp Sumter, commonly known as Andersonville, was a military prison operated by the Confederacy during the US Civil War. Even by the low standards of prisons at the time, Andersonville was notoriously horrible. The prison was overcrowded, and prisoners were forced to sleep in the open in disgusting unsanitary conditions. During the Civil War, 13,000 prisoners died in Andersonville. Following the war, Captain Henry Wers, the camp's commander, was tried and hanged for war crimes. Sergeant James Landon, a Union soldier from Iowa, was one of the unlucky ones who ended up in Andersonville. During a skirmish, Landon was shot in the thigh. He pried the bullet out using his knife and ran on foot from Confederate forces for 5 days before being captured. He was then forced to march for another 4 days to Andersonville. As a wounded soldier entering Andersonville's unsanitary conditions, Landon didn't stand much of a chance. Amazingly, Landon survived. He was held for 6 weeks in Andersonville before being transferred to another prison camp. He was released from there after 2 months, as the Confederacy was crumbling and could no longer afford to hold prisoners. Even more amazingly, Landon didn't receive proper medical treatment until he arrived back in the North. He lived until the age of 83 and was reportedly healthy and athletic throughout his life.
Before we move on, I've got a little challenge for you that will take just 5 seconds to complete. So here's the deal. You just leave a like on this video, smash that subscribe button, and hit the notification bell and you get 25 years of amazing logic. Try it. It really works.
Number 9. Judah Paddock and the crew of the Oswego. When British or American sailors were shipwrecked off the Barbary coast, their best chance of survival was to make it to Morocco, which was friendly to both governments. However, if they were captured by any of the nomadic Arab tribes of the Saharan Desert, survival would be much more difficult. Judah Paddock was the captain of the Oswego, a merchant ship that ran aground in 1800. The crew was forced to abandon ship and set out on land. But when a schism developed among the crew, Paddock set off on his own just with 3 other crew members, one of whom was a useless drunkard. The survivors were captured by Arabs, who turned them into slaves. The new slaves were treated badly. They were flogged, starved, and forced to sleep outside on a regular basis. As slaves, they were the most valuable as commodities and were often traded or sold from one tribe to another. Paddock believed that this was his only reason that they weren't killed on the spot, although this didn't save some of Oswego's other survivors, who ended up murdered. Paddock came by to be owned by a man named Ahmed, whom Paddock convinced to take him to Morocco to be ransomed. But even that required a difficult journey, as well as careful navigation, and Paddock was not able to save his entire crew. Number 8. Robert Jeffrey. Robert Jeffrey was a British seaman who was pressed into service on the Royal Navy sloop called the Recruit, commanded by Captain Lake during the Neapolitan Wars. Impressment was a form of conscription practiced by the Royal Navy at the time, so naturally Jeffrey was resistant to serving on the Recruit. Jeffrey was caught stealing beer from the ship's store. As punishment, Captain Lake decided to maroon Jeffrey on a deserted island without any supplies. When Lake's superiors found out what happened, they ordered him to go back and retrieve the stranded man. Upon returning to the island, they found no trace of him and assumed he was dead. An inquiry was held, and Captain Lake was dismissed from his post. Jeffrey, in fact, had managed to survive by eating limpets and drinking rainwater. After 9 days and some unsuccessful attempts to flag down passing ships, Jeffrey was rescued by an American ship. The ship took him back to Massachusetts, where he lived for a number of years. Only later did the British government find out that Jeffrey was still alive. Number 7. Dr. William BRYDON. In 1839, British soldiers occupied Kabul in an effort to prop up a friendly ruler to prevent Afghanistan from allying with Russia. However, just after 2 years of occupation, they lost control of the city and were forced to retreat. A group of 4,500 soldiers and 12,000 civilians left Kabul for India on a journey that was difficult and dangerous. Not only did the group move slowly, but temperatures dropped below freezing and they came under attack from Ghazai warriors, as well as the forces of Muhammad Akbar, an Afghan warlord. After only 5 days of retreat, 12,000 had been massacred, and the British army was totally surrounded. One of the last alive was Dr. William BRYDON, an army surgeon who was a part of a group of about a dozen trying to make it to Jalalabad. Riding a wounded pony, BRYDON was able to fend off attacks from pursuing Ghilzai swordsmen despite losing his own sword, until he was close enough to Jalalabad where he was spotted by sentries who came to his aid. Of the entire column that left Kabul, Dr. BRYDON is the only person known to have survived. Number 6. The Overland Relief Expedition. In the winter of 1897, a fleet of 8 whaling vessels along with 265 crew members was trapped by ice in the Arctic Ocean. Because of the thick ice, it would have been 6 months before rescue vessels could have reached the trapped ships, and the crew stood no chance of survival without food and supplies. The dangers of the Arctic were well known, and the situation seemed dire. Just 2 decades earlier, 13 vessels had been lost in the same area. Sensing the urgency of the situation, President McKinley ordered the U.S. Coast Guard Cutter Bear, under the command of Captain Francis Tuttle, to deliver supplies to the trapped whalers. The Bear sailed as far as north as the ice would allow it and landed 3 crew members off the coast of Alaska. Using dog sleds, the 3 traveled over 2,400 kilometers across the frozen tundra, where the temperature sometimes dropped to -51 degrees Celsius. The entire journey took 3 months. When they finally reached the ships, they were able to deliver critical supplies to the whalers, many of whom were suffering from scurvy. The Bear itself was not able to reach the area until July, when the ice had broken up enough to allow passage. Until they did, Captain Tuttle had no idea if the overland journey had been successful. It had, and the Bear was able to bring the whalers back home, the majority of them having survived. Number 5. The Darien Exploring Expedition. The Darien Exploring Expedition in 1854 was a U.S. venture to explore the area that would later become known as the Panama Canal. A party of 27 men under the commander of Lieutenant Isaac Strain traveled deep into the Panamanic jungle seeking a water route from Caledonia Bay on the Atlantic Ocean to the Darien Harbor on the Pacific. However, for some reason, they only brought enough provisions for 10 days, and they soon became lost and separated. At one point, the party met a group of friendly natives who hoped they would lead them back to a river that led to the Darien Harbor. Instead, they were led in the wrong direction and became even more lost. Still, the party voted to continue on rather than return to their ship. This proved to be a costly mistake, as they were further off course than they thought, and their maps of the area were incomplete. Trudging through the jungle, they encountered dense brush, relentless mosquitoes. They ran out of food, and their feet became swollen from walking. Strain, an experienced adventurer, declared that it was the most difficult jungle that they had ever traversed. At one point, they built a raft, only to be forced to abandon it soon after. With no choice but to continue on foot until they reached the Pacific, men began to drop dead of disease and malnutrition. Eventually, Strain managed to reach the Pacific coast, where he acquired canoes and supplies to take back to his men, who could no longer travel. He returned to find some of them dead, and many others starving, filthy, and sick. 9 of the expedition's men died. Number 4. Alexander Scott. One of the most dangerous sailing routes of the 19th century took ships between the Canary Islands and the western coast of Africa. Challenges along this route included strong currents blowing towards shore, sandy air, and shallow waters. Shipwrecks were common. Alexander Scott was a 16-year-old sailor from Liverpool, England, whose ship, the Montezuma, was wrecked off the Saharan coast in 1810. According to his own narrative, Scott was captured by an Arab tribe which took him as a slave. They forced him to travel with them to a place called Hesh. The arduous journey across the Sahara took over 2 months, during which Scott encountered very little in the way of civilization. When they arrived at Hesh, Scott was told that he must convert to Islam or be killed. Scott said that he refused to convert, although he didn't say how he managed to escape being killed. Although he remained alive, Scott was anything but free. He remained a slave for 6 years, wandering with various Arab tribes around the present-day Niger and Mali in conditions that were often difficult and dangerous. Eventually, Scott managed to escape and contact the British consulate in Morocco. Number 3. Wreck of the Medusa. In 1816, the French ship Medusa was sailing from Senegal on a diplomatic mission. Included among the 400 passengers and crew were many notable French politicians, soldiers, and diplomats. However, for some really dumb reason, the French selected an inexperienced captain to command the ship, and the Medusa soon ran into trouble. Despite clear weather conditions and calm seas, the Medusa ran aground on a reef in the Atlantic Ocean. The crew was forced to abandon ship, but didn't have enough lifeboats to go around. The most important passengers got into the lifeboats, and the remaining 150 were forced to float on a raft made of lashed-together masts and beams. The situation on the raft was grim. First, the lifeboats tried to tow it, but they ended up having to cut it loose. The raft was also too heavy, so food and other supplies had to be thrown overboard. Even then, the raft remained submerged under as much as 1 meter of water. The first night on the raft, 20 people were either killed or committed suicide. By the end of the 4th day, the food had run out and the survivors had to resort to cannibalism. When the raft was finally found, after 15 days at sea, fewer than 15 men remained alive. And now get ready for today's top pick. Number 2. Jack Renton. Jack Renton was a Scottish sailor who had the misfortune of being shanghaied while in San Francisco in 1868. After escaping in a smaller boat and spending 40 days at sea, Renton washed up on one of the Solomon Islands. He was captured by a native tribe, the Malaysians, who were notorious among sailors as headhunters. However, Renton managed to amaze his captors with his survival and language skills. They adopted him into the tribe, and the chief even started referring to him as his favorite son. Renton was also distinguished himself as a warrior, taking part in headhunting expeditions and skirmishes with other tribes. After 8 years, Renton decided he'd had enough and found a ship to take him to Australia, where his tales of the Solomon made him an instant celebrity. He occasionally returned to the island on the humanitarian expeditions. It was on one of these return trips that he was captured and decapitated by one of the Malaysians' rival tribes. Renton's stories live on, however, in Malaysian oral traditions. Number 1. Captain James Riley. Captain James Riley and his crew were wrecked off the coast of the Sahara when their ship, the Commerce, ran aground in 1815. After a failed attempt to escape by boat, the men were captured by nomadic tribes who took them as slaves. As slaves, the men were held in terrible conditions and forced to march across the desert with very little food or water. Often, the only sustenance available was camel milk or urine. Suffering from exhaustion and malnutrition, the men lost weight and one of them even resorted to chewing on his own flesh. Their captors were cruel, even when they were trying to help. The cure for dysentery was to brand those afflicted with a heated knife on different parts of the body. Maintaining his role as captain and looking out for his men's freedom, Riley negotiated to be sold to an Arab trader named Sidi Hamet, who agreed to take Riley and 4 other crew members north, where they could be ransomed. During the long and arduous journey, they traveled as much as 80 kilometers a day by camel and had to endure all sorts of dangers, including ambushes. Riley's ordeal lasted 2 years. When he returned to the United States, his account of his journey became a bestseller. Thank you for watching today's video. We hope that you enjoyed it. Please stay tuned for some more great content.